Okay, everyone, welcome back. We're going to start with part 2 of From Tudor Trumpets to Trouillots Silence, a journey from diversity to decolonization. And in this part, we're going to focus really on how I've moved from spending most of my career looking at ways in which I can diversify the curriculum and building representation in the classroom, so that the kind of students that I have are reflected back in the curriculum that they receive. And I'm going to move into why I have now kind of moved towards decolonizing the curriculum in the school that I work with and supporting other teachers to do the same. And I think the really massive turning point for me was when I read this absolutely fantastic book, Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. And I strongly, highly recommend that all history teachers watching this, anyone who's watching this, reads this book. It is a powerful, brilliantly written, witty, engaging, wonderfully researched piece of writing, which just touches on so many important issues around history, anthropology, sociology, politics, contemporary culture, and it's just a very personal and engaging story and narrative, but also a brilliant piece of polemic and wonderfully written. And it was totally inspiring, as you can hear. And I've put a link to the Channel 4 program, which I watched recently, in which kind of Emma interviews various people about their experiences and touches on a lot of the themes from the book. But I really wanted to kind of share with you the text which just jumped out at me when I was reading this and just turned my whole world upside down, having taught in the classroom for 26 years at this point, and never really thought about what she was saying here. So I'm going to just read through what she said, because it just changed everything for me. So she writes, unless something had a direct parallel in European society, usually it went unseen. As a result, many rich, complex cultural phenomena were merely discarded and dismissed as primitive, and certainly never made it into the annals of history. European culture placed value only on the written word, on art and on monuments that stood the test of time. The emissaries of European culture remained illiterate in much that existed of value in oral societies, including the intricate language of hairstyling, unable to understand the ephemeral temporality of this art form. So what struck me as a thunderbolt when I was reading this and the rest of the book was that for all the years I've been teaching history, I had, not surprisingly, kind of continued to teach the Western construction of history and Western approaches to the writing and recording of history. And I realized that the way in which I was teaching history was paralleling that experience. And as I started to learn more and I started to educate myself more, I became increasingly aware of the way in which that approach towards history, which is kind of focused around the written word, which is focused around the prominence of the source, which is focused on a time scale which is fairly static, has marginalized and continues to marginalize indigenous cultures. And as you'll see when we look at some of the other writers that I started to read about, that the domain of history, the, I can't think of the word off the top of my head, but the kind of history with a capital H was used as a weapon of colonization. And we have historians, not now, hopefully, but certainly some, David Starkey, for example, are still arguing that African history, African cultures, in this particular instance, are not of the same value or of the same worth as the kind of European history, culture, and so on. And so I was very, very struck by this, and I wanted to kind of explore this a lot more. And so I was introduced to Samantha Cutrara and her work. She's a Canadian history teacher and academic. And I started to read through her articles, and she has written quite extensively about the Indigenous communities in Canada, First Nations as they are often referred to, and looking at the way in which those communities are now campaigning hard, have been campaigning hard for many years to teach history in Canadian schools in a much more inclusive and meaningful ways. And another article, one of the articles that I read from her was this one. And again, I would just be happy to share what she's written with you. And so she was talking about the way in which historical thinking, she cites particularly the work of Peter Seixas, who she's quite critical of. She talks about this approach of historical thinking. Through historical thinking, Indigenous epistemologies can only be present within a colonial grammar of understanding. They can only be present when the stories told by elders are considered an equal critical stance to that taken by formally trained historians. In this way, stories that feature Indigenous narratives and perspectives become open to assessment and evaluation in ways that suit the demands of the colonizer more than the truths of the storyteller. The stories became filtered through and weighed against a colonial tradition characterized by a drive to see, to traverse, to know, to translate, to make equivalent, to own and to exploit. It's based on the belief that everything should be accessible, is ultimately comprehensible, and a potential commodity or resource, or at least something that can be recorded or otherwise saved. So again, that really struck a chord with me about the way in which we need to think very carefully about the sources that we use, the stories that we use, and more significantly, the way in which we are looking to use these stories and the way in which we are respecting traditions which are very different from our own. And also I have to now, I'm openly and happily questioning my own position as someone within the community who has, spent many, many years writing about, recording, learning about Black history, setting up a website called Black History for Schools. And now I'm questioning whether that is longer an appropriate thing for me to be doing as a privileged white male. Obviously, the fundamental reasons why I'm doing it is because I am a believer in equality, equity, and believe that the position that I've taken has opened up materials and stories and resources to the wider history teaching community, and that's the reason why I do it. But I'm questioning now whether really these stories should be driven by people who are from those communities themselves rather than through a filter like my own. And following up from Cutrara, I came across Lyndon-Cohen Smith, and I would again strongly recommend that people have a look at her seminal piece of work called Decolonizing Methodologies, which you can see on that link. You can get a copy of it on a PDF. And if you are pushed for time, just read the first 50 pages or so, which is an absolutely phenomenal piece of work, full of passion, full of righteous anger, full of energy, and just kind of making it so clear to why we need to be very, very conscious of the way in which the structures in which we are working and the way in which we're operating has for centuries marginalized Indigenous communities. And again, to summarize what she's saying, I don't do justice to her work, and so this is what she has said. And there are many more other examples other than this, where she talks about every issue has been approached by Indigenous peoples with a view to rewriting and rewriting our position in history. Indigenous peoples want to tell our own stories, write our own versions, in our own ways, for our own purposes. It's simply not about giving an oral account or a genealogical name of the land and the events which raged over it, but a very powerful need to give testimony to and restore a spirit to bring back into existence a world fragmented and dying. The sense of history conveyed by these approaches is not the same thing as a discipline of history, and so our accounts collide, crash into each other. And so I'm trying to navigate now through ways in which I can recognize within my classroom these clashes, these collisions between different approaches to history. It's hugely exciting to be able to kind of bring this into the classrooms that I'm teaching. And the students that I'm working with are responding in ways I would never have even imagined about how deeply they are reacting, responding, and understanding some of these hugely complex issues. And that relationship that I'm building with all of those students who we've worked through this is just awe-inspiring. And I have not had that for many, pretty much my entire career. I don't think the way in which I've taught these lessons has engendered such a strong kind of connection with some of the students that I've worked with. And the final thing, which kind of led me down this path, and I'm hoping that people will be more familiar with this work. It's a book by Michel Rolfe, Trouillots Silencing the Past. Truillot, a Haitian historian. And the beauty of this book is the way in which it uses not just a really clear structure for arguing how history, the construction of history, the discipline of history has created these silences. But he's also not afraid in the first two chapters, 2 or 3 chapters, to look at his own country's history and Haiti's history and debunk some of the myths which are created of the kind of hero narratives around Toussaint Louverture and some of the other leaders, Dessalines and others in the Haitian Revolution. And so he's done the work in his own community as well to explore the ways in which silences are created in history. So I have taken his work and I've tried to think very carefully about how I can put this in an effective way into my classroom. And so what Trouillots says is that silences enter the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments. The moment of fact creation, which I've simplified for my students as the kind of making of sources, the moment of fact assembly, the making of archives, the moment of fact retrieval, which is the making of narratives, and the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. And so what I'm going to share with you now is how I've tried to bring in Trouillots' work into the classroom and build in his work and build in the work of Emma Dabry and kind of create some lessons around this. So the first thing I wanted to do was to try and find a way in which I could actually kind of draw analogies with my own experience and Trouillot's work and try and explain what he means. So I presented to my students my own kind of moments of fact creation, which are photo albums which I produced. My wife and I have kind of made for my children when they were 2 years old and 5 years old. And this was our sources that we were using. This is our kind of creating our facts. And I gave another example was that every year on kind of the night before our children's birthday, we write a letter to them, just talking to them about their year and kind of sharing those stories with them. So these were ways in which we kind of created our family history. The second thing I wanted to share with the students was an activity which we did with them in the first week of the first year, first term of the first year in year 7. And I've been very lucky the last few years to have a fantastic archive of our local history around the school. And a former deputy head in the school, or assistant head, gave me this suitcase which came from a woman who lived locally to the school, whose house the teacher had bought, and she found this suitcase in the attic, and it was just jam-packed full of paraphernalia, memorabilia from the woman who had lived in the house. And so the teacher brought it in to me and said, you know, thought you might be interested in this. And I spent about 5 hours plowing through all of this stuff, which pretty much looked like this photograph at the beginning. Lots of kind of odd bits and pieces, newspaper cuttings, pictures, diaries, and so on, and just came across incredible nuggets of wonderful stories, including the fact that she was invited, or members of her family were invited to the opening of the cenotaph in 1921, and not quite still can't answer that question of why this family in particular were invited. But I'm getting off on a tangent. But anyway, the point was I was trying to use that as a way of showing the students this is an archive that we're using. This is something that I'd created from those collection of sources. And so when we talked about the archive, we talked about the way in which silences were created. And I was able to share with them that when I chose and I selected those, the bits to stay in the suitcase and the bits to discard, there was a power relationship going on there. I was the one in control. I made those conscious choices to what material to save and what material to discard. And so they were able to kind of grasp that fairly quickly. And then the kind of final thing which we kind of shared with them was the way in which we try and look at the kind of received narrative, the grand narratives, and look at the way in which we challenge some of those narratives in the Key Stage 3 curriculum at our school. So you can see the list there, the kind of things that we do. So when we teach the transatlantic slave trade, we'll explicitly look at how African history was silenced. Same for when we teach Indigenous American, Native Americans. Same when we look at the history of women in the UK, and certainly when we teach the history of the LGBT community. Again, all of these units will now kind of deliver through this lens of silences and why these silences have been created in the past. So I'm going to now just share a couple of examples, a few examples from some of the lessons which I wrote. Again, there's a lot of this stuff coming out of Don't Touch My Hair, because there's one particular story which I'll share with you, which just again completely blew my mind. I was very, very excited when I found out about it. So I wanted to get the students to understand that certainly in relatively recent history, we've had eminent historians arguing that there is no kind of African history. There's only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbus America. And so I wanted to set up the lesson to give the students the opportunity to challenge that misconception and look at ways in which he'd come to those conclusions and the reasons why there were silences in the history of Africa, according to some European historians. And so we're kind of trying to raise two areas to focus on. The first, looking at the idea that Africans were deemed inferior in multiple different ways. And obviously that was the kind of grounding for race-based approaches towards enslavement and kind of racist legacies of colonialism and imperialism. But the second thing I wanted to do, and sorry, the first element around kind of the construction of race was something which I was already teaching in lessons around transatlantic slave trade, and kind of already felt a kind of connection with the students by teaching through that lens. But the second part, and looking at the way in which history is being produced or constructed, and the way that's different from, in this case, African historians, griot storytellers, and just getting the students to understand that there are different approaches towards kind of memorizing the past or remembering the past or constructing the past. So I was kind of shared resources like this from other colleagues whose name I really should remember, but I'll add it in on when it comes to me. I should have made my notes, so I'm very sorry. But again, looking at people like Knox, who were writing about the Africans in the kind of 1850s, and we get the students to kind of question whether this is an example of Africans being inferior, or is this a way in which history is constructed? And then we'll kind of compare it with kind of different approaches. And here is here was a story which I was kind of referencing a few minutes ago, which completely blew my mind, and it was just hugely eye-opening when I heard about this story. And so Emma Dabry talks about a place in Colombia called San Basilio de Palenque, which was the first free or maroon town in South America. Former enslaved Africans who fought for their freedom and set up their own communities. And what they did, which was an absolute kind of genius idea, was that the women in the town would braid into their hairstyles and into the hairstyles of the men a map to Palenque. And it would show all of the essentially the kind of pathways or the rivers that they should go through in order to get their freedom. And I just thought this was such an incredible story. And I just could not understand why I've been teaching transatlantic slave trade for 20 plus years. And this was the first time I've ever heard this story. And it just kind of, again, made me kind of question, like, where am I getting my stories from? I'm getting my stories from written sources. I'm getting my stories from picture sources. I'm still kind of like using the kind of Western conventions of approaching history. I would just like those Europeans, those kind of Spanish colonizers in Colombia, who had no idea that these maps existed in those freed women's hair. I, as a kind of modern Western history teacher, I had no idea about these stories because it was so far out of my kind of world. It was, I'm not surprised that I didn't know about it. But now I do know about it, and I want to share this story because it is an incredibly powerful story on multiple levels. So I've told this many times to my students. There's also the quote at the top comes from a band, a hip-hop band from Colombia, who have written about the hairstyles. And this is the kind of chorus of their song: "Hairstyles helped us during slavery because with them we drew the perfect map for a black person to find liberation." And so again, I show that to the students. I share them the story about Palenque, and it's just been absolute gold dust that every student has gone away. They've remembered this incredible story, and they've understood the power of this kind of knowledge. And then we looked again, Emma Dabry again kind of talks around kind of language, Dinkra, symbols, kind of Western Africa, probably around Ghana. And so we're trying to get the students as well to have some understanding of this and recognize again that the European historians and certainly the contemporary Europeans who were kind of traveling around Africa, who may have seen these symbols and just dismissed them as kind of like childish drawings, lacking the kind of level of civilization of European people. Again, we've got a brilliant opportunity to kind of share that with our students and get them to understand the depth and the meaningfulness of these symbols, and how sophisticated they are, and how powerful these symbols are within those communities. And so it was another really accessible way for our students to really understand that. And so then we finally kind of moved on to answering the question that we posed, which is explain why some historians have argued that Africans have no history. So this is the first time that we had done this work, and we're talking about some very, very complex, kind of mind-blowing issues, certainly for me. And so my kind of expectation for the students was, I didn't really know what was going to come out of this piece of work. And I knew it was challenging, and I knew it was hard, and they were grappling with some really tough stuff. And so I was excited to see what they wrote. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples from you, with you. And I just think you can just see here how deeply some of these students have understood exactly what we were talking about. Africans were said to have no history because they recorded history differently. In Africa, most history was recorded in words and stories, was knowledge being spoken. In contrast, the Europeans based most of their history on diaries and letters found in old places. Of course, you're not going to find diaries and letters in anything but an old place. Therefore, when they enslaved the Africans, they saw no written history and assumed there was none at all. And that final sentence for a 12, 13-year-old year 8 student to have kind of taken in that level of understanding was just awe-inspiring for me. I just thought that was such an amazing outcome, not just because of the way they're writing it, but what they are saying. They just really, really understood this on such a deep level. And I was so delighted. And then another student who's clearly kind of understood and picked up this idea from Trouillots of the silences. Some historians have argued that Africans have no history because of silences. Europeans saw Africans as inferior, which meant that historians wrote about them in a negative way. They cite Knox's work and talk about it being an example of how history was written. They talk about Africans being seen as less intelligent, less civilized than Europeans, when in fact African women used to braid their hair into mats, helping their escape, proving that they were as intelligent as Europeans. Secondly, Africans played the drums to help others escape slavery, share stories, share joy, share pain. And Europeans wouldn't have understood what this means, as a result not writing about it, creating a silence. And finally, some African communities use symbols to share their ideas and history. Historians would have missed the importance of this, thus creating another in silence because they did not write about it. So again, just the way in which they synthesized some of this hugely complex material, some of that knowledge that they've picked up from these wonderful stories, and the way in which they've brought all of that together in their writing just completely blew me away. I was so overwhelmed by how well the students work with this material. I'm so excited to see that. I'm just going to kind of move on and just talk about the last couple of things, really, about the way in which this new knowledge is transforming my teaching. And I wanted to share a project which I'm just embarking on, and it's around an archive, which you can find out lots more about in this on the website, the Tape Letters project. And so the Tape Letters project is an ongoing project about the British Pakistani community, and it focuses in particular on a small community within that larger community who are Potwari speakers. Now, Potwari is an oral-only language. And so the people who lived within those communities in Britain and in Pakistan from the kind of 1960s to 1980s were kind of communicating with their families, and many of them couldn't afford to have phones and couldn't afford the long distance phone calls. And so they sent cassettes to each other, back and forth, sharing their stories, sharing their experiences. And the colleague that I'm working with, who has researched this, found these cassettes, and has produced some absolutely incredible sound collections and sound installations, has done stuff at the People's Museum in Manchester, various other places, worked with the Bishopsgate community. So he approached me to see if there was a way in which we could get some of this material into the classroom. So this is the project which I'm working on at the moment. And it just sat so well with all this work that I've been doing around Truillot, and in particular kind of ways in which these communities would have been marginalised, ignored, not kind of considered as something as part of our kind of wider kind of traditional narrative. And the oral element of this is this is fundamental to this project. And so I was very excited to find a way in which we could bring these oral histories directly into our classroom. And so these are the kind of ideas that we are bouncing around. And what I'm trying to do is try and find inquiry questions which are based around extracts from these oral interviews, from the tapes and so on. So the first one again kind of hit me like a punch in the gut as a good kind of, well, again, it really kind of, I'm trying to find a way to express this, but it made me again have to question my own beliefs and my own kind of political ideas and ideologies and all of those kind of things, because, I guess I can't deny the fact that much of my teaching around empire has erred on the side of challenging kind of the legacy of empire, and kind of exposing to the students some of the negative elements of empire. And so to read in this archive, in this interview, that British Pakistani man, highly educated, PhD, highly literate, is arguing vociferously, very clearly, that British presence in India was a blessing. So it's not for me to challenge those beliefs. His experience is far, far more valid than myself as an outsider. And so I'm, again, like, having to kind of question all of these things, or at least question within the classroom and get the students to kind of question in the classroom. Received wisdom, certainly, from myself. So that's been a good lesson for me. And then I've kind of like moved through these different inquiry questions just to try and get a sense of some different elements. So we've obviously got the question around empire. We've got the key central question of partition, which is, we're going to explore this quote around it being the central historical event in 20th century South Asia. And then just starting to shift from that into looking at the experience of the British Pakistani community and look at questions around migration. So kind of the final two, again, just kind of really powerful questions. Why did Mahmoud Arshad say British Pakistanis will, quote, never feel that they are British? I think that's going to elicit some really, really fascinating responses in the classroom. And the last question we wanted to tackle was around this use of technology and the way in which technology and communication are being so intertwined, how liberating in many ways has been, and question whether, as Parveen Fakanda says, without these cassettes, quote, we'd be broken into pieces. So this is such a rich kind of collection of materials. I'm just so excited to do this and kind of really bring a strong oral history element into my Key Stage 3 lessons. And I was very kind of inspired by the work of Nathaniel Davies, who's Another History is Possible is his website. He's written a brilliant article in Teaching History, last edition, and I would strongly recommend you have a look at the work that he's doing, which is phenomenal. I'm going to just kind of wrap it up now with the last thing which I wanted to share. This is something which I haven't, again, quite got to writing yet, but I'm very close to. I mentioned in part 1 about the unit we've done on LGBT history, which I'm very, very proud and very excited to teach this year. And one of the things which I was inspired by, again with Dr. Kutrara, was to read her article about archives and the way in which she worked with undergraduates to kind of look at the way in which they constructed a digital archive. And the way in which she kind of facilitated that approach really kind of changed for her and for the students the power of the archive, and looked at those kind of silences within archiving and ways in which that can be tackled. And so we've decided that what we want to do for our students is to create our own digital archive, thinking about this kind of inquiry question about pop culture and Parliament, which is done more for LGBT rights in Britain, and see if that as well will kind of pull out some of these issues around archive material, about how we construct archives, about what sources we are choosing to keep and to remember, and so on. And so again, I'm very, very excited in the future. I'll be able to hopefully share the results of that. So that's kind of really it for my journey into decolonisation. It's a very early step in that direction, but I'm hoping that people will have seen some of the ideas that I've been working with, and the ways in which I'm trying to put it into my classroom. And I'd be very excited to kind of answer questions around that and share ideas and find out what other people think about what we're doing when we go through our Q&A on Twitter on December the 10th. I'm going to finish by just kind of showing the places that you can find all of the resources that I've produced on these topics which I've been talking about in these 2 sessions. That's my email address, that's my Twitter handle, so please, please, please do get in touch, share your ideas, share your thoughts, critique what I said, give me feedback, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to, from Tudor Trumpeters to Trouillots Silences, my very personal journey from diversity into decolonization. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this video from the Be Bold History Network. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter @BeBoldHistory, and if you are talking about us, use the hashtag BeBoldHistory.